And the first call we have this morning is from Peter in Notting Hill. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Nigel. Just a quick question about whether you would agree that the media are misleading us when they constantly refer to the migrants at the border of Europe as refugees. When Eurostat figures for the first quarter 2015, which are the latest available, show that actually only 16% of those migrants are Syrian, and I think it's 26% are Kosovan. And even the BBC, which we know is fairly left-leaning and has a certain political bias, actually says that Kosovans are almost certainly likely to be economic migrants. That's on their website.
Well, Peter, when I heard you were from Notting Hill, I quavered slightly, wondering whether you were part of the Notting Hill set. But I can see that you're a man of independent thinking. It is remarkable. I was with Jean-Claude Juncker last week, and I spoke to Franz Timmermans, the number 2 in Europe now, yesterday, and they keep talking about the refugee crisis. The definition of a refugee, Peter, is actually quite simple because it was laid out in 1951 in the Geneva Convention. And a refugee is an individual who is in direct fear of persecution as a result of their ethnicity, religion, class, political beliefs, orientation. So it's perfectly clear. So, for example, in the 1930s, we didn't say Hitler's an awful man and doing terrible things, so please, can everybody in Germany, as quickly as they possibly can, come to the country? No, we said Jewish people and certain intellectuals, because of their beliefs, are threatened with direct persecution, and we offered them refuge. What the European Union, Peter, has done, and I laid this out in a speech in April, 9 days before the general election. I pointed out that the European Union's common asylum policy has redefined what a refugee or asylum seeker is, way beyond what the Geneva Convention tried to do back in 1951, to include people who come from war-torn areas, to include people who were displaced, and even to include people leaving countries of extreme poverty. And in doing that, what the EU has basically said is that most of the world, if it wants, can come. The argument about Syrians is a more recent one. You will have noticed, if you look at the footage, that actually 70% of the people that come are men between the ages of 18 and 35. And he may be wrong, but the Slovakian Prime Minister says 95% of the people that have come to Slovakia are economic migrants. So we've got this completely, the European Union has got this completely and wholly wrong. I reiterate, that I do think that civilized countries should do their bit to help genuine refugees, but you have to get your definitions correct, and you then have to do what you can to try and find out whether these people have first been brainwashed by ISIS.
Quick response from you, Peter.
Yeah, I don't agree with everything that Nigel says, but I do agree what he just has said. But what I would add is what really concerns me is there are 4 million migrants in various countries around Syria, those neighbouring ones, and they are headed for Europe because they are only temporarily there, despite what we're told by the media. They're basically in temporary accommodation, and none of those countries has actually signed the 1951, has been a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So they don't have the same rights and abilities that they have in the EU. And then we have another 7 million internally displaced in Syria, who are also quite likely headed for Europe and the EU. And then on top of that, there's another 12 million in the country. So this is the potential that really concerns me. And then on top of that, you have countries like Nigeria, which have problems with ISIS-affiliated Boko Haram. Nigeria has a population of 174 million, and it is forecast to grow by the UN to 440 million by 2050.
Peter, you are very, very well informed. A figure that I'm sure you know, but the listeners won't, and that is that the UNHCR have said there are 59 million displaced people around the world at the moment. Is Mr. Juncker seriously saying that every single one of them is welcome into Europe? I think he is. Right, we must move on to Joy in South Croydon. Good morning.
Good morning. Why can't this country take all the orphaned children we're sending a Navy vessel out to take refugees to Italy who are full up. But it's the children. It's these children that are really affecting the British people. There's been an outpouring of British people who are offering help. In the Lords, last night, there were 6 lords and 1 bishop talking about the refugee crisis. What a disgrace. What is the church doing? Where are the powerful voices? You have a powerful voice. I don't.
Well, the churches, that's a very interesting point. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has urged us to be a civilised, decent country, which, Joy, I believe we are.
What about the idea of taking all the orphaned children?
Well, that's not an easy thing to do. Joy, we have to define who are genuine refugees. I made that point with Peter, the previous caller. Yes, of course, one has sympathy and we could help with orphan children. But the difficulty, Joy, is this. What we have done, and I'm pleased to say that the British have not done this, but what the rest of Europe have done, and Merkel, what on earth she thought she was doing, we've sent out a message which says, please come to Europe and come as quickly as you can. We have played directly into the hands of the criminal trafficking gangs, and we are leading directly to people drowning in the Mediterranean. That is what we do.
When you say we, you don't mean the British government?
No, I mean the European Union. I think the British have taken a sort of backward step from this and have listened to the arguments, and I'm pleased to say the British government now agree that encouraging people to come across the Mediterranean in the hands of these traffickers is very, very dangerous.
Mr. Cameron's
indeed.
decision to go to the camps in Lebanon and elsewhere, that's correct.
It's better. Even that's not perfect, because when Mr. Cameron went to the camp in Jordan on Monday and was photographed there, he was there with a Jordanian minister who warned him that 2% of the camps are radical jihadist fighters. So none of this is straightforward. Joy, on a human level, I completely understand what you're saying. I will go on making the argument for us to help genuine people. But what we must not do, us or the rest of Europe, is be an accessory to this horrible criminal trafficking of people, which is leading to so much death and misery.
Quick response from you, Joy, before we move on.
Yesterday, on the television, there was tear gas in a little baby. There's a child on the side of the road screaming, lost its parents. Reporters are there. Cameramen are there. There are children suffering in a devastating way, and Britain is doing nothing.
Well, in Hungary, Joy, what was happening was Hungary decided the time had come to protect its borders and put up a fence, a perfectly reasonable thing for any country to do. And a lot of young males were attempting to smash down those fences and to illegally enter Hungary.
So would I.
And I just asked myself, if you were a mother of a young child, surely you would have stayed back from that fence and not been right up against it. So I think it's very easy to see an image that is distressing on television of a young child, tear gas and all the rest of it. But actually what Hungary were doing were protecting their borders. And I mean, what would happen, Joy, if tomorrow morning 10,000 people marched through the Channel Tunnel into Folkestone? Would we expect the British authorities to say, oh, jolly good, we're very pleased to see you, have a cup of tea? Or would you expect the British authorities to say, actually, you cannot enter this country illegally? And the problem is not the Hungarian government, it's not the Slovenian government, it's not the Croatian government. The problem is the German government, who have sent out this message, please, everybody come as quickly as possible.
She's gone rather quiet now, though, hasn't she?
Well, she's clearly made one of the biggest political errors, I think, of her life. And
will she be aware of that, Mr. Farage, do you think? She must be fairly astute, if nothing else.
One of her immigration ministers resigned overnight, which gives you a feeling that Chancellor Merkel, although she has a big level of support in German politics, has made a very bad error and is directly leading to some of this human misery.
You're on a nationwide tour at the moment, going to various theatres and meeting with people out there. I think you were at one last night. Is this dominating the work you're doing in these shows?
I was in Purfleet last night in Essex. We had 1,300 people attend the event. And I'm talking about the referendum and why I think we should leave the EU and be a self-governing nation. And sure, there are lots of people there who run small businesses who are concerned about red tape, regulation, and if we were out of the EU, could that free the burden? But let me tell you, the completely overwhelming feeling I get with the questions that come in from the audience, with the people I meet afterwards, overwhelmingly, there is one issue completely dominating people's conversations and discussions, and the British people are not without compassion. I can, reassure Joy on that, but they are deeply concerned about what is happening to Britain with legal immigration, given that 642,000 people settled here last year. They're deeply concerned about what's happening with illegal immigration, because we know that every single night in those lorries and containers from Calais and Dunkirk and elsewhere, there are people coming into Britain. But the biggest concern of all is through illegal immigration, legal immigration, and through migrants and refugees coming across the Mediterranean. Their biggest concern is, are we importing terrorism? And that is a genuine and real concern. And I think, quite frankly, our government and Westminster politicians have ignored this for too long. I notice overnight the British security forces are speaking up very clearly and very strongly on this. And it's suggested that already we may have as many as 3,000 radical jihadists.
This is Andrew Parker, the Director General of the MI5, saying that number, around 1,000, 15 of whom could be in London and the South East.
Well, only last week. I drove back through Calais last Thursday, and there was a manhunt going on in Calais, lights flashing everywhere. The French police were looking for somebody known to be in the jungle, as it's known in Calais, an ISIS activist who'd stated he was coming to London to plant bombs. So this stuff is very, very real and very, very frightening.
We move to other callers.
We do. We move to Lawrence in Esher. Good morning.
Good morning to Nick. Good morning to Nigel.
Morning, sir.
Thank you for having me. I really want to bring the discussion back to Jeremy Corbyn. Somebody who for 32 years has been on the backbench always saying no, elected by some mass hysteria. He was reported to say he would be campaigning to be out of the EU. He now, apparently, has flip-flopped and wants to campaign to stay in. Now, before you answer that, there's one other rather important and maybe emotive thing about this man who refused to sing the national anthem at the service to remember the few of the Battle of Britain. However, he's quite happy to raise his fist and sing the red flag.
Lawrence, I was there in St Paul's Cathedral. I was 2 rows behind Jeremy Corbyn. I saw him turn up. We all have different ideas of what is the correct attire for any event. I thought he was scruffy. I thought he was, frankly, on the edge of being slovenly. And at that service, that's probably the last time, Lawrence, that there will be a significant gathering of the few. There were 2,950 men who flew in the Battle of Britain, 544 killed in the battle, a further 800 killed before the war had ended. There are now, I think, 32 people left from the few. Quite a few of them were there in the Abbey. And if you're going to turn up, if you can't be prepared to show respect, least of all, not just respect to the Queen, but respect to those men and lots of women there in their 90s who'd been ground crew and manned anti-aircraft guns and all the rest of it. Well. And widows, absolutely. And if you can't be prepared to at least show some respect and courtesy to those people, it would have been better, in my opinion, for Mr Corbyn not to have turned up at all. Now,
what about his inability to do up his top button, Mr Farage? He's almost like a recalcitrant schoolboy.
Yeah, I think he's sort of aged about 17, isn't he? And no, shan't. And we've all done a bit of that in our time. But generally, we sort of get older and we grow up, and maybe 30 years on the back benches without ever having been a spokesman or ever having had to be responsible for anything meant that he hasn't quite matured.
And his performance, appearance at PMQs, were you able to see that, Mr Farage?
I did see it, yes. It was an interesting try to neutralise the first PMQs, but it won't work next time. That's the point. It won't work next time. And, there is a very important job that opposition does in British politics. It holds the government to account. It allows the nation to see somebody, rather like a barrister cross-examining you in a courtroom, and it puts the government on their mettle, and they have to defend to the nation what they do. It's actually why parliamentary democracy works, and he didn't quite do that. My real worry, though, leading on to Lawrence's question,
is regarding Europe, is the germ of Lawrence.
Well, precisely. So surely, if an opposition leader, even if he agreed with the EU, should be challenging the Prime Minister on his renegotiation, and is he actually bringing back the bacon to this country? Mr Corbyn, who voted no in 1975 in the referendum, who lists as his all-time political heroes, I'm not going to say Marx and Lenin, but lists as his all-time heroes Tony Benn and Michael Foot, two giants intellectually of the left in Britain since the war, both of whom were vehemently opposed to Britain being part even of a common market, let alone a European Union, on the grounds that we should be a national democracy. And we know that Mr Corbyn in private thinks the EU is awful. Because it,
how do we know that?
Oh, because everyone that knows him knows it. And you saw all the indications of the early interviews and what was said in the run-up to the campaign. And now, it's just this abject surrender. He knows that most of New Labour were completely taken in by the European project. From Neil Kinnock onwards, they'd been opponents, they became supporters, and he knew that his own parliamentary party didn't support him, and so tactically he's decided to back the EU. But to say that whatever can you imagine if the Prime Minister comes up with something absolutely awful, that the renegotiation means our terms are worse, and Mr Corbyn isn't going to challenge anything he does at all. He has completely failed. I think he's failed many of his supporters who thought he was a man of principle, but more importantly for our democracy, he's failing to provide opposition on the greatest political issue of the day.
And how important an ally might you have lost?
Well, I've always taken the view, Nick, that the European Union question is not a right-wing question or a left-wing question. It's a fundamental question of who we want to be as a nation. And I would have been happy to share the platform with Mr Corbyn in this campaign. I think what's interesting is he might have made Chuka Umunna happy on the back benches, but he might just have put himself at odds with the British trade union movement, because there is a whole new debate going on within the British trade union movement. They're worried about the transatlantic trade treaty. They're worried that actually this has become a Europe not of workers' rights, but a Europe of giant corporate interests.
And cheap labour.
And cheap labour and all the rest of it. And I see some real changes. That TUC conference this week was really interesting. Paul Kenny of the GMB, people like that saying that they will be watching very carefully to see what Mr Cameron comes back with. And you may find that Mr Corbyn has made friends with the Notting Hill set and fallen out with the people that just voted for him and put him in place.
We move on, Mr.
We do, and we go to Kim in Bristol.
Morning, Nick. Morning, Nigel.
Hello, morning.
Do you think that it's now time for our government to side with Putin and support Assad in getting rid of ISIS?
So I'm sorry I'm laughing. I'm a bit confused, Kim. Perhaps you can help me. Because it seems to me that 2 years ago... Let me get this right. That's right. 2 years ago, Assad was evil.
Yeah.
And the rebels were really marvellous. They were so marvellous that we should spend vast amounts of money arming them and supporting them in any way that we can. And there were some of us out there that thought that was perhaps rather mad, as we didn't quite know who the so-called rebels were, and we clearly made a bit of a mess of Libya the year before. Luckily, Parliament and the country overturned Haig and Cameron's fanaticism to get us involved in the Syrian war. And then it turned out that the rebels were actually called ISIS. So now we're going to bomb the people that we were going to arm 2 years ago. So does that mean that Assad is now our friend? Well, listening to George Osborne the other day, he seemed to say he was against ISIS and against Assad. So perhaps we're going to bomb everybody. Kim, I've no idea what's going on here. I have no idea what's... Now, let me say something now that I know will be hugely controversial, and I will be screamed and shouted at by absolutely everybody in Westminster politics. I do not like Mr. Putin. I would not like to live in Russia. I think that a journalist like old Ferrari here would disappear pretty damn quickly.
So it has its plus side.
But as many have done. as many have done.
Yeah.
Clearly, the way that Assad has treated opponents with their treatment in prison and all the rest of it. These are not people I would want to take home to have tea with mum. But let me say this, Kim. I think that the biggest external threat that we face and that I believe our children may face, and this may go on for many decades, is this battle against fundamental jihadism. And that in that great, bigger battle, we need to actually think strategically, whether we like him or not, that actually Putin and Assad are on the same side as us.
Quick response, Kim?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that we have to stop looking at the smaller picture, which is obviously Assad, who we may not like, and Putin, who we certainly may not be friends with at the moment. And we have to look at the bigger picture, which is ISIS, who are the people we need to be stopping in their tracks. And so, yes, I think we need to side with them at the moment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Where do we go now, Mr. Farage?
We go to James in Heathrow. Which terminal, James?
The terminal velocity at the moment. My question for Nigel is this. And this is the 21st century, right? Are there any industries that... hold on, I'm trying to read my own writing here, and I've had to write it down on slate. I've had to write it down on a slate with a bit of chalk. Would think... Is there any industries that you would think as technology-phobic, or is the outgoing mayor, Boris, would say, Luddite?
Luddite, are they? Now, this you may remember, you may not be aware, Mayor Johnson perhaps choosing an unfortunate word, Luddite Industries. Mr. Farage.
Do you know, when you face new technology, or you face new mass production techniques, they pose a challenge, and a challenge that in many ways you adapt to. I mean, when much of a textile industry, went to the Far East, and they could manufacture, bulk wholesale shirts and import them back to Britain very much more cheaply than we could produce them. What we had to do was produce higher quality, higher end shirts. You have to adapt and change. I thought for Boris to want to go to war with the London cab drivers, frankly, was a very silly thing to have done. Because, I mean, it would be ludicrous, James, to ban Uber. You can't stop the march of change. You can't stop the march of technology.
What if they're operating illegally then, Mr. Farage?
No, that's quite different. That's quite different. I mean, we don't want Uber to be a cover for the black economy and for people who aren't paying taxes, so there does need to be a registration scheme, and that's absolutely clear. But if the Uber cabs are legitimate, then that's fine. My experience is this. I believe that the London taxis, far from being Luddites, are the best taxi drivers in the world. They do, that knowledge test they do is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It's like an apprenticeship. They do it very, very well.
They fund it themselves as well.
They fund it themselves. Of the thousands of cabs I've taken over the years, 99.9% of cab drivers have been polite, amusing, informative, and also innovative. If they see a traffic problem, they think of a way around it. My experience of Uber, and I'm sure there are some wonderful drivers working for Uber, but some of my experiences of Uber is I've got into cars with quite loud music playing, with people that don't speak English, and who use the sat-nav because they haven't got a clue where they're going in London, and they're not innovative. So I actually think that what Boris should have said is that whilst new technology is welcome, provided it's registered and within the law, we should champion London black cabs, because if people want quality, they've got to pay a little bit more for it.
Thanks, James. Where now?
Thank you. We go to Peter in Swansea. Good morning.
Good morning, gentlemen. My question for Nigel is this. Nigel, would you advocate the use of water cannons and tear gas on the British public?
No.
Under any circumstances?
No, not the way we do things. It's rather the same argument, Peter. Should we arm our police officers? I think it would be a very retrograde step if we armed our police officers. And I don't want to live in a country that regularly uses tear gas and water cannon. I've seen that regularly myself in Strasbourg. When the
deployment of it.
Oh yeah, I remember once standing up on the roof, and the French dockers, 20,000 of them, had sort of arrived.
They mean business, don't they?
They're quite serious people, and they'd arrived to storm the Parliament, and there were these 20,000 dock workers, hundreds of French riot police, firing tear gas at them, and I felt like a general sort of watching a grand battle. The trouble was, I wasn't sure whose side I was on. And Peter, the answer is no, I don't want us to go down that route. I want us to have civilised policing and be a civilised society. Yes, there may be times if things get desperate where we have to resort to tough measures, but I don't believe that it's the right direction for us to go in.
A couple of email questions, if I could put you. Rachel in Bexley, when a judge says that you should lock up sex abusers for longer terms if their victims are Asian girls because they could be involved in an arranged wedding, is the judge right?
How long have we got? Of all the things I've seen this morning, that was the one thing. I sort of, you look at it and think, is it April Fool's? Surely this can't be happening in my country. Surely we can't be allowing institutionalised racism within our judiciary.
Isn't it an aggravating factor the court has to take into account that a young woman...
So, are we now saying we approve of arranged marriages? I thought we believed in emancipation. I thought we liked women having the vote, having jobs. I thought we were arguing for more women to be senior in business and to be in politics. And at the same time, we're prepared to say that we think arranged marriage...
You don't agree with it as opposed to forced marriage? You don't agree with arranged marriage?
Very, very blurred lines of distinction, I would suggest, between the two.
And the court here is wholly... I'm taking it the court is wholly wrong with this judgment.
I think it's the most disgusting judgment. I mean, either we live in a country where we treat everybody equally before the law, regardless of their colour or regardless of their religion. If we start to head down this path, I don't like it one little bit.
And one last one, Fiona in Clapham. On Nick Farage's show yesterday, Zach Goldsmith, who might be the Conservative mayor, said it's time to put more stop and search in the streets. Theresa May is wrong and more children are being stabbed. Does Nigel Farage agree?
I have to say, every initiative that we've seen over the last few years to halt knife crime doesn't appear to me to have worked. The one danger, Zach, if you do become mayor, is that you get back into another row about who the police stop and do they discriminate. But I think on balance, he's probably right, yes.
I'm sorry, I think we've just dropped that call, so I will introduce the next call. It's Ahmed in New Malden. We've just lost Richard. Do try again. We've got a couple more minutes. We go to Ahmed. You're through to Nigel Farage. Go ahead, Ahmed.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Mr. Farage, my question is about Islamists, homegrown Islamists, extremists, fundamentalists. Now, recent reports suggest that there are 3,000 homegrown jihadis. I believe this is only the tip of the iceberg. We're going to have much more bigger problem on our streets in time to come, in the future, if the government does not take really very robust action and introduce zero tolerance. Mr. Farage, what do you advise? What would you advise the government to do? What action should the government be taking?
All right, Ahmed, let's get it over to Nigel, only because we're on about the last minute, sir.
Ahmed, a slightly depressing analysis from you, but one that is probably true. First thing I'd do is to say, when the government tries to stop people leaving the country to go and fight in Syria, I would encourage them to go and take away their passports and not let them back. I find that a very bizarre way of doing it. I think at the end of the day, the only way we're going to beat this is through the security services and is through technology. And one of the points being made is that people like Snowden, who sort of blew out a lot of a lot of very privileged information, actually have made it easier for people now to circumvent the security services. There is some evidence, Ahmed, that the big internet search providers are not perhaps fully playing ball with our security services, and I've always been a great believer in liberty and a reduction of state interference, but I've had to come to accept over the last 18 months or so that the threat we face, and I do agree with your analysis, the threat we face is so great that we have to do everything we reasonably can to stop it.
And just give me your take on this then. A young mum goes off to try and join the freedom fighters of ISIS with 4 children. You obviously, I sense you wouldn't want mum back. What about the babies, Mr. Farage? Well, the children, I should say, not babies.
I mean, that's clearly different because they can't make their own minds up.
So you might bring the children back?
Yes, but
mum having made that decision to go
tough. No.
We have a final call.
A final call. Seconds to go. Peter in Edgware.
Oh, good morning. My membership's run out of the of UKIP, and what can you persuade me to rejoin? Because all we seem to be doing is talking about is immigration and EU. It's getting boring. There's a lot of other things to talk about, like the economy.
Yeah, well, Peter,
aviation.
Peter,
okay, let's hear from Mr. Farage.
Peter, we had a general election in which I attempted to cut through Mr. Osborne telling us how prudent he'd been, and that woman north of the border telling us we must spend even more. And I try to cut through it by saying, can we please be honest and admit that this prudent government has doubled the national debt in the last 5 years? They've increased our debt by more than Labour managed to do in 13 years. That took some doing. And I actually put on the table £32 billion worth of proposed cuts. And you know what? I couldn't even get an audience. I have tried to talk about the economy. I have tried to talk about our farming industries, our fishing industry, small business. I have tried, and I go on trying, and I will do in the referendum to say, as I did with Nick Clegg when Nick Ferrari hosted that first debate, we don't need to be part of the EU to make our own global trade deals. We should be re-embracing with the Commonwealth. We should bring an Australian-style point system. But if we get back, Peter, to the EU, I've spent 23 years now battling on this issue. For most of it, I felt like I might just become the patron saint of lost causes. But we now have a referendum, Peter, and UKIP is the only grassroots organisation in this country that can take this message out to millions of people. And that's why I was in Margate last week, Belfast on Monday, and in South Essex last night. And we will be out. We have 300 public events planned for this referendum campaign already. And if you believe, Peter, in the things that we believe in, come and help us.
Keep on trying, and many might say you are quite trying at times.
Well.
Nigel Farage, leader of UKIP, thank you for appearing on Phone Farage on LBC, where news is next.